Hi, this is Kelsey Bukowski, and in Unit 2, Part 3, we'll be looking at political participation as well as polling, two very important things within our political system. So let's first start off with classifying voters in really to four main groups, the ones that you see here. So we had talked about ideology, more specifically liberals, libertarians, and conservatives. Typically, we lump them into the two main groups of liberals and conservatives. And when we talk about an ideologue, they are somebody who is purely libertarian, conservative, or liberal. They only think in those types of ideologies, if you will. A second group is known as group benefit voters, and this is where you see where most voters, 42%, could be lumped in. They vote based on how candidates serve the needs of their particular social group. So if your social group might feel overtaxed, then you might be more inclined to vote for the politician who's going to lower your property taxes or your income taxes. You might be a social group that might feel, at the same time economically oppressed in the sense that it's very hard to get ahead economically in the country. So they might be leaning toward a candidate who might allow for more pathways to college that might be paid for or subsidized by the government. And a good way to think about that one would be maybe you might be more inclined to vote for Bernie Sanders. Or if you are, again, against taxes, being overtaxed, you might find somebody who's anti-Bernie Sanders. So that would be a group benefits voter. You also have nature of the times voters, which make up a large chunk, about 1/4 of American voters, and their view of politics is based on whether times are good or bad. Really, the worst thing that can happen to a politician in office is if the economy tanks. And typically, when the economy tanks, they tend to blame people who are in office, even though the reality is, Republican, Democrat, they typically don't have that much control as we might think or hope of controlling the economy. But nevertheless, people vote and keep people in office, typically speaking, during good times and vice versa during not so good economically times, if that makes sense. And then you also have no issue content voters where they vote routinely for party or personality. So you might be always Republican, no matter who the person is, you will vote Republican or vice versa for a Democrat, somewhat in line with ideologues as well. So it's important to keep that in mind that ultimately the majority of voters are group benefit voters. How can they benefit? So when we look at political participation, and these of course are activities used by citizens to influence the selection of political leaders or the policies they pursue. Well, how do normal people participate in politics without being the president? Well, the most common form is actually voting in presidential elections, more specifically. That's the number one way of conventional participation that has shown up in previous AP Gov exams. Also working on campaigns or maybe even running for office. It does not have to be national office by any means. It can be running for mayor. It can be running for town council or some leadership position in government. It could also be contacting an elected official. It could be writing to a newspaper editor. These are conventional or standard ways in which voters can participate. Now, when we look at unconventional methods, protest is amongst one of the more common ways. So, of course, when you think protest, you might think back to the 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr., and this is in line with civil disobedience, which was very common in the 60s, where this type of political participation, where you're making this conscious decision to break a law that you believe is immoral. So, for example, if you think segregation was immoral, hopefully we all do, then you would purposely violate that law. So a good example, think Martin Luther King with civil disobedience. Certainly you should have that U.S. history knowledge as well. So keep in mind there is some overlap between these two courses as there is some history here. Now when we look at political participation by family income, it is interesting that the wealthier you are, the more likely you are to donate money, but really not too much of a comparison here. This is actually one of the lesser ways of political participation. Really, attending meetings you see is higher for people of wealthier means. But if you are of limited means, you might sign petitions. You're more likely to contact your politician or attend a meeting, as you see here. But it does make sense that if you are under this threshold, you're probably not going to have enough disposable income to donate to a political campaign. So another thing you should be aware of are people known as political elites. And they are important because they can shape public opinion as well, especially when we talk about political activists who tend to be elites. A good example of this would be Michael Moore, if you're familiar with his documentaries, whether it be Fahrenheit 9/11 or the more recent one being Sicko. He has more access to the media. He has certainly wealthier means where he can shape people's thoughts. And certainly there are a good number of people who follow him, but at the same time, a number of them who do not like him. Nevertheless, it's important to know that even amongst elite groups, they are not unified. Sometimes they have their own specific issue or agenda that they want to bring to the forefront of Americans and to shape public opinion. And Michael Moore is a prime example of that. Okay, we're going to move on to part 4 of public opinion in this video. And when we look at public opinion, it is the distribution of the population's beliefs about politics and policy issues. This is essentially measured through polls. Polls are always coming out, even years before the election, where they're always matching up potential candidates who are running and putting them against them. Some politicians, love polls if they're showing good numbers for them. At the same time, politicians can hate polls, especially if they do not reflect something positive. Also, in terms of polling, demography is important because population, especially in the United States, is rapidly changing. And we look at demography through the census, which of course is conducted every 10 years as required by the U.S. Constitution. So again, just to lump this all in, some terms you might want to be familiar with in terms of when discussing the American people. Of course, the United States is known for being the melting pot, certainly the mixing of cultures. A good example of this would be in New York City, where you might have Little Italy, you have Chinatown, you have Greenwich Village, and you have all these different populations living in the city. It is also important to note the minority majority, which is the emergence of non-Caucasian or non-white majority. Specifically, the biggest demographic growing in the United States are Hispanics, and this certainly is going to affect the political landscape in terms of future elections. So when we look at the coming minority majority, as I was saying before, Hispanics are certainly on the rise. And when we look at white non-Hispanics, that is going to be declining, especially since 2010, a very steady decline there. So it is important to keep in mind that with a melting pot, you have different values, you have different cultural beliefs that are always changing. And of course, when we look at Hispanics more specifically, they are the largest minority group faced with the problem of illegal immigration. And this has always been a major issue, especially in the last 15 to 20 years. And there have been efforts to secure the border. There's also the issue of illegal immigrants in the United States today. There have been acts, in particular, the Simpson-Mazzoli Act, which requires employers to document citizenships of their employees. So that's important to know. When we look at other minorities within the United States, Asian immigration has been driven by a new class of professional workers. You see this in California with African Americans, certainly a legacy of racism, and certainly in the past 2 or 3 years with the Black Lives Matter movement, that has come up as a major political issue for politicians. And then you also have with Native Americans certainly being disadvantaged on reservations. So you have within the United States, aside from the non-white, or aside from the white majority that still exists, within the minority community, you have certainly pockets of problems that politicians are probably going to pay larger attention to. Now, the graying of America certainly is interesting as the baby boomer generation is growing significantly in terms of aging. They are the fastest growing age groups over 65, and they are certainly going to continue. The problem here is the drain on Social Security, as this is a pay-as-you-go system. In 1942, 42 workers per retiree. Now, with the lower birth rates, you have a mere 2 workers per retiree. So this is something that you're going to have politicians having to deal with in probably the next 10, 20 years. So as populations do shift, there has been a migration more towards the south. And as that's happened, you've seen the Northeast actually lose a couple representatives. In particular, New Jersey lost one after the census was conducted because with the members of the House of Representatives, reapportionment happens. So if more population is happening in Texas and you have millions going in there, but people are being drained from New Jersey, because the House of Representatives is based on population, it has to be reapportioned. So certainly be aware of that word reapportionment, in which you are reallocating the seats of the House of Representatives, because again, 435 seats that are going to be distributed by population. Now, let's look at polls. Very important to know. Having a sample is important. And if you were going to sample Americans on whether or not they like Barack Obama as president, and you only went into a very conservative part of Texas and you asked 100 people, well, even though you have 100 people, which may sound like a good amount, can you generalize that toward all Americans? And you can't, because it's important that when you have samples, they are of a size of at least 1,500 to 2,000, not to mention that they have to be a mixture or a random sampling. Random sampling is very important to make sure that the polls that you get are accurate, and make sure that everyone should have an equal probability of being selected for the sample, especially if you're going to generalize this as all Americans. Certainly when you do have these polls being conducted, it's always interesting, if you look at the recent poll, that there is something called the sampling error, the level of confidence in the finding of a political or of a public opinion poll. Generally, there's a plus or minus 3% sampling error with a 95% confidence interval, meaning that they are 95% sure that these polls are accurate based on the ways that they conducted it. Now, it is important to note the power of words and as to how you phrase a poll. So if you said, hey, how do you feel about a estate tax? That is probably a more neutral way. But if you were to say, hey, how do you feel about a death tax? Nobody likes that. I mean, that sounds very biased. Other examples of this is, what's wrong with some of these methods? Asking survey participants to call in their vote. Well, you're now relying on people to call you instead of the pollster calling random people. Or what happens if you're only polling people at a retirement home to gauge the nation's views on healthcare? Certainly they're going to have stronger views on healthcare as opposed to the average American might be between 25 and 50. So, even also these are good ways of, is perhaps a poll's bias. For example, are you in favor of killing babies in an abortion survey? Well, that's very skewed the way that you ask it. So it's important that even the way that you phrase a question is neutral and does not lead people one way or the other. But certainly polls are important. They help to put a pulse on the public's preferences. Some critics do say, of course, that polls make politicians think more about following than leading the public, that they don't take their own initiatives. So it's important. Politicians will always claim that the polls don't matter for the most part, but be rest assured that all politicians are always looking at polls all the time. Now, when we look in terms of elections, there are something called the exit polls. These are used by the media to project election day winners. The problem with this is that they can discourage people from voting. Some people, in particular in California, they used to release exit polls, and they actually used to predict who would win prior to the election or voting being over. And people in California already sees that, somebody won in New Jersey, somebody won in Ohio already, but the polls are still open in California because they're on Pacific time, and that might discourage them to vote. So now exit polls are still released. However, typically media outlets are not going to say one person won or not until all polls are closed. So polls ultimately do assist politicians in detecting their public preferences, shifts in thinking. But one thing that is going to be in effect is something called the bandwagon effect, where politicians are more eager to jump on board instead of doing what's right. And you always see politicians sort of doing that, what's popular, not going against the grain. So let's finish up with a review question here. Take a moment to read it and then answer it. So if you need to use the pause button, please do. Okay, so what would be the best way to ask a citizen their viewpoint concerning abortion? And if you selected choice E, do you believe abortion should be legal or illegal? You are correct. Killing babies certainly is certainly bias. Do you favor allowing women to make decisions regarding their bodies? Again, bias. Do you like abortion? Again, you are sort of leading on that question. And then do you believe the government should interfere with a woman's right to have a baby? Again, a little bit misleading. The best answer, of course, being E.